The wind howled over the dunes, whispering through the tall grasses that lined the edge of the sea. The lighthouse stood on the highest bluff, its skeletal frame of iron and stone wrapped in the mist that rolled in from the black water. At its peak, the lantern burned, a sickly yellow glow that never wavered, even when the storms raged and the tides climbed higher than they should. Fishermen spoke of the light in hushed voices, their hands tightening on their nets whenever it was mentioned. It was said the lantern did not simply guide sailors to safety but warned them of what no one dared say. The old keeper, a hunched and weathered man named Elias Crow, rarely left his station. When he did, he spoke little, his eyes shadowed with secrets. That night, young Henry Vale stood at the shore, watching the light pulse against the mist. He had heard the story since childhood, tales of ships that vanished beneath waves blacker than ink, of whispers carried on the wind, of footprints in the sand that led nowhere. The older folk warned him to stay away from the bluff after dark, but Henry was drawn to the lighthouse like a moth to a flame. His lantern flickered as he made his way up the winding path, the cold biting through his coat. The night was unusually silent, save for the distant crash of waves. Even the seagulls, who usually shrieked at all hours, were absent. When he reached the lighthouse door, he hesitated. It was cracked open, the wind nudging it against the frame. Light seeped from within, not the steady glow of the lantern above, but something else, something unnatural. It pulsed like a heartbeat, casting long, shifting shadows against the stone walls. Henry swallowed hard and stepped inside. The room was cramped, cluttered with books and instruments of unknown purpose. The air smelled of oil and salt, and in the center of it all stood Elias Crow, his back hunched, his long fingers curled around the lantern's iron frame. The flame within it burned with an eerie brilliance, too bright and too dark all at once. "You shouldn't have come." Crow's voice was little more than a whisper, but it carried through the chamber like the toll of a bell. Henry took a cautious step forward. I just wanted to see." "You don't want to see," Crow interrupted, turning his gaze upon him. His eyes, pale and clouded, seemed to glow in the dim light. "You want to know. That's worse." Henry felt a chill wrap around his bones, as though unseen fingers had traced his spine. The wind outside howled, and the lantern flared. Crow's voice lowered to a grave murmur. "The light warns of what waits beyond the water. If it ever fades, if it ever goes dark," his breath hitched, "they will come." Henry wanted to ask who, what, but the words died in his throat. Outside, the waves crashed louder, and from the distant horizon, something stirred. Henry's breath felt shallow, as though the very air inside the lighthouse had thickened, pressing against his ribs. The flame in the lantern flickered, just once, just briefly, but it was enough. Elias Crow's gnarled fingers clenched the iron frame, his milky eyes wide with fear. "You saw that, didn't you?" Crow whispered. Henry nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The old man turned sharply, moving to a wooden table littered with strange brass instruments and crumbling charts. He fumbled for a tattered notebook, its pages stained with oil and seawater. "It's not supposed to flicker," he muttered, flipping through the brittle sheets with trembling hands. "Not even in the strongest winds." Henry took a hesitant step closer, his boots scraping against the stone floor. "What does it mean?" he asked. Crow stopped flipping the pages. For a long moment, he simply stared at the lantern, watching the glow pulse like a living thing. "It means," he said finally, "that they've noticed." A gust of wind slammed against the lighthouse, rattling the windows. The flame inside the lantern flared and dimmed, as though struggling against some unseen force. Henry felt the hairs on his arms rise. The air was charged, heavy with something unspoken, something ancient. Crow moved quickly, gathering tools, adjusting dials, whispering under his breath. Henry stepped forward, peering over the man's shoulder at the open notebook. The words were barely legible, scrawled in a hurried, desperate hand. But one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "If the light fails, the sea will take them." Henry swallowed. "What's out there?" The old keeper stilled. "Do you believe in ghosts, boy?" Henry hesitated. I don't know." Crow let out a hollow chuckle. "Neither did I. Until I came here." He gestured toward the swirling mist beyond the windows. "They don't come from the land, Henry. They come from the deep." A chill crawled up Henry's spine. The old stories of lost ships and drowned souls returned to him with terrible clarity. Tales of sailors who went missing without a trace, of boats found adrift with no crew, of voices carried on the wind, calling for help long after they should have drowned. A sudden knock echoed through the lighthouse. Henry and Crow froze. Another knock, harder this time. It came from the door Henry had left open, now standing slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. Beyond it, the night was black as ink, the mist swirling like living tendrils. Crow moved first, gripping Henry's arm with surprising strength. "Stay behind me." The old man stepped toward the door, his oil lamp casting long, shifting shadows. The wind howled, carrying with it a sound that was not the crash of waves nor the rustling of grass. It was a voice that did not belong to anything human. Henry's pulse hammered against his ribs. He wanted to run, to flee down the cliffside, back to the warmth of his home. But something in the way Crow held himself, the way his eyes darkened with the weight of knowledge, kept him rooted to the spot. The keeper reached the door. With a single, deliberate motion, he pulled it open wider. The light from his lamp spilled out into the night, illuminating the twisted, mist-choked path leading down to the sea. There was no one there. But the footprints in the damp earth told a different story. They led from the water's edge. The footprints were wrong. Henry didn't know how else to describe them. They weren't the deep, solid impressions left by a person walking barefoot through damp earth. These were shallow, uneven, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had barely pressed against the ground at all. Some prints seemed smudged, blurred at the edges, as if the wind had tried to erase them but failed. Elias Crow stood motionless, his lantern casting a pale glow over the prints. The wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. Henry swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. "They came from the water," he whispered. Crow nodded grimly. "They always do." Henry turned to him, searching his face for some explanation, some reassurance that this wasn't what it seemed. "Who are they?" he asked. The old keeper exhaled slowly. "Not who, boy. What?" A sudden gust of wind rushed up from the cliffs, strong enough to send sand swirling around their feet. The footprints blurred even further, the mist curling around them as if trying to pull them back into the sea. Crow stepped closer to the prints, kneeling down with great effort. He reached out a gnarled hand, tracing a trembling finger along the edge of one of the tracks. His expression was distant, as if recalling something long buried. "This is the third time this year," he muttered. Henry frowned. "The third time for what?" "The third time they've come ashore." A shudder passed through Henry. "What happens when they do?" Crow was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the distant shoreline, where the dark waves crashed hungrily against the rocks. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "People disappear." The words sent a chill through Henry's bones. The old man rose to his feet with a grunt, his fingers tightening around the lantern's handle. The flame within it flickered again, just once, but it was enough to make Crow's expression darken. "They know the light is faltering," he muttered. "They are waiting." Henry's breath caught. Waiting for what? Crow turned to him, his eyes heavy with a warning that felt older than the lighthouse itself. "For it to go out." A sudden noise split the night, something between a whisper and a sigh, carried on the wind from the direction of the footprints. Henry spun toward the sound, his heart pounding. The footprints had changed. They no longer led inland. They were leading back to the water. Henry blinked, his breath catching in his throat. He could have sworn, just a moment ago, they had pointed the other way. Crow's hand clamped down on Henry's shoulder, firm and unyielding. "Inside. Now." Henry didn't argue. They retreated into the lighthouse, Crow slamming the heavy door shut behind them. The old man threw the bolt, then pressed his ear against the wood, listening. Henry stood frozen, his mind racing. The storm outside grew stronger. The wind wailed through the cracks in the stone, and beyond it, buried beneath the crashing waves, something else moved. Something that should not have been there. Crow turned away from the door, his expression grave. "We must keep the light burning," he murmured. "No matter what." Henry swallowed hard, his eyes flickering to the lantern at the top of the lighthouse. Outside, the footprints in the sand were gone. But Henry knew, deep in his bones, that whatever had made them had not left. The storm howled through the lighthouse, rattling the windows in their frames, pressing against the heavy stone walls as if trying to get in. The air inside felt thick, charged with something unseen, something waiting. Henry stood near the base of the winding iron staircase that led to the lantern room above, his eyes fixed on the steady glow of the light overhead. It had flickered again, just once, just briefly, but it was enough to make the hairs on his arms stand on end. Elias Crow moved with purpose, his gnarled hands grasping at tools and supplies. He worked by the dim glow of his oil lamp, his face gaunt and shadowed. "We don't have much time," he muttered, more to himself than to Henry. Henry swallowed, his voice hesitant. "What happens if the light goes out?" Crow froze, his shoulders stiffening. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, slowly, he turned to face Henry. His pale, clouded eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. "They come." A gust of wind slammed against the lighthouse, the sound like a great exhalation from something deep beneath the waves. The walls groaned, the glass panes trembled, and somewhere above, the lantern flickered again. Henry forced himself to breathe. What are they? Crow moved toward the staircase, gripping the rail as if the weight of his years had suddenly doubled. "Long ago," he said, his voice low, "this light was built to keep sailors from the rocks. But there were some who claimed it was never meant to guide ships to safety." He gestured toward the lantern room. "They say it was meant to keep something out." Henry's chest tightened. "Out of where?" Crow didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for Henry to follow. "Come. I need your help." They climbed the spiraling staircase, their steps ringing against the metal. The higher they went, the colder the air became, until Henry could see his own breath curling in the dim light. When they reached the lantern room, Crow stepped forward, his hands moving swiftly to adjust the mechanisms. Henry's gaze drifted to the great glass windows that encircled the tower. Beyond them, the storm raged, waves crashing against the cliffs far below. But it was the mist that unsettled him most, thick, shifting, alive. And then he heard it. A whisper. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A voice, carried on the wind. Henry turned sharply to Crow. "Did you hear that?" The old man didn't look up. "Don't listen." But the whisper came again. Closer. Henry's breath hitched as he strained to make out the words. It was not one voice, but many, layered over one another, rising and falling like the tide. "Help us. Let us in. We remember you." The lantern flared, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. Crow worked faster, his fingers moving with urgency. "They know you're listening," he murmured. "That's how it starts." Henry forced himself to look away from the windows, from the swirling mist beyond the glass. His hands clenched into fists. "What do they want?" Crow turned to him, his expression grim. "To take back what the sea has stolen." The words sent a chill through Henry's bones. Outside, the whispers grew louder. And then, against the glass, a handprint appeared. The handprint lingered on the glass, pressed against the outside of the lantern room's great window. Pale, wet, impossibly high above the churning sea. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The storm screamed against the tower, and yet, somehow, the mark remained, clear, distinct, human. But no one could be out there. No one. Elias Crow did not look at the window. He did not stop working the lantern's mechanisms, adjusting the flow of oil, tightening the glass chamber as the flame within sputtered. He moved with the practiced precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. "Don't look at it," Crow murmured. Henry's heart pounded. There's a handprint." Crow's grip tightened on the lantern's brass fittings. "I know." Henry took a step back, his gaze darting to the mist beyond the glass. It curled and swirled, shapes shifting within it, dark figures, glimpsed only for a second before melting into the fog. The voices whispered again, overlapping, layered, broken like the cries of drowning men. "Help us. We are waiting. We are hungry." The wind howled, shaking the lighthouse to its foundation. The flame inside the lantern dimmed, flickering violently. Crow let out a sharp curse and grabbed a brass canister from a shelf, his hands shaking as he poured more oil into the feeding tube. Henry turned back to the window, just in time to see the handprint vanish, as if wiped away by an unseen force. But something worse replaced it. A face. Pale, sunken, pressed against the glass. Its skin was the color of drowned flesh, its eyes wide and unblinking, mouth slightly parted as if whispering through the barrier. Seaweed clung to its hollowed cheeks, strands of wet hair drifting as if moved by currents that did not belong to this world. Henry stumbled backward. A cry escaped his lips before he could stop it. Crow slammed his palm against the lantern's frame. "I said don't look." Henry tore his gaze away, gasping for breath. His chest was tight, his limbs numb. But the whispering continued. Crow worked faster, his hands a blur. The flame pulsed wildly, shrinking, growing, shrinking again. Then, suddenly, it steadied. The light flared bright, filling the room with golden radiance. For the first time since Henry had entered the lighthouse, the whispers ceased. The wind outside lessened, the mist thinning ever so slightly. Henry dared to look again. The face was gone. The window was empty. Only the storm remained. Crow exhaled, slumping forward slightly. He pressed a trembling hand against the lantern's base, as if drawing strength from it. "Too close," he muttered. "Too damn close." Henry swallowed hard. His voice came out hoarse. "What was that?" Crow turned to him, his expression unreadable. Something that should have drowned long ago. A chill ran through Henry's bones. The storm still raged outside, but the mist had begun to recede, curling back toward the waves. The sea no longer looked like a void, but Henry could not shake the feeling that something had retreated beneath its surface, waiting. Crow sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "The light keeps them at bay," he said softly, "but they always try to return." Henry's fingers curled into fists. He didn't know what frightened him more, the thing he had seen, or the knowledge that this had happened before. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. Crow glanced toward the lantern, its golden glow reflected in his clouded eyes. He seemed to weigh the question carefully. Then, finally, he spoke. "Long enough to know the light must never go out." The lighthouse was silent. Not the kind of silence that came with peace, but the thick, waiting quiet that follows something unfinished. The storm outside had lessened, the wind retreating into uneasy whispers, the sea rolling with a slow, patient hunger. Henry stood frozen, staring at the place where the face had been pressed against the window. His breath came in shallow gasps. They were real," he murmured. Elias Crow gave him a tired look. "You needed proof." Henry shuddered. He didn't know what he had expected when he climbed the bluff that night. Perhaps a glimpse into the lighthouse's eerie mysteries, a story to tell the old fisherman in town. But this was something else. The old keeper turned back to the lantern, running his hands over its brass frame like a priest tending to an altar. The flame burned steady now, but Henry could still feel the weight of whatever had been watching from the mist. "How long have they been coming?" Henry asked. Crow exhaled slowly. "As long as there have been ships to wreck. As long as there have been men foolish enough to cross these waters." His fingers traced the worn edges of the lantern's glass. "Some say they were once sailors, drowned in storms, taken by the tide, never given a proper grave. Others," he hesitated, "others say they were never men at all." A chill curled around Henry's spine. "Then what are they?" Crow's gaze darkened. "Things that the sea keeps, boy. Things it won't give back." Henry swallowed. "But if they were sailors, why don't they just move on? Why do they keep coming here?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost reluctant. "Because their names were never spoken." Henry frowned. "What do you mean?" Crow turned toward the far wall, where an old wooden cabinet stood beneath a faded chart of the coastline. With slow, deliberate movements, he pulled open the heavy door. Inside were books, dozens of them. Some were bound in cracked leather, others barely held together by twine. The pages were yellowed, stained with time and salt. Crow reached for one of the oldest volumes, its cover warped and brittle. He flipped it open, running a finger down the page. Henry stepped closer, his eyes narrowing at the strange, slanted handwriting covering the parchment. Names. Row after row of names. Some he recognized from town, old family names that belonged to men who had been lost at sea. Others were unfamiliar, foreign, written in languages Henry couldn't understand. "What is this?" he asked. Crow's gaze remained fixed on the book. The names of the drowned. Henry's throat tightened. All of them. The old man nodded. Every soul claimed by this coast. Every sailor, every fisherman, every lost traveler. He turned a few pages, the ink fading in places. The ones who are remembered find peace. But those who are forgotten, his voice trailed off, his fingers tightening on the paper. They come back. The words hung heavy in the air. Henry looked at the open book, at the endless lists of names, and felt something settle deep in his bones, a weight, a terrible understanding. Outside, the mist still clung to the waves. Somewhere in the darkness, the sea whispered. And it was waiting. The storm returned with a vengeance. Waves battered the cliffs, rising higher than they should, as if the sea itself were reaching for the land. The wind howled through the lighthouse, shaking the glass panes in their frames. And somewhere beyond the mist, they waited. Henry stood beside Elias Crow in the lantern room, watching as the great flame above them flickered wildly. The old keeper worked frantically, hands moving with a desperation Henry had never seen before. The brass mechanisms groaned as Crow turned the oil valve, trying to feed the failing fire. It wasn't enough. The lantern sputtered, its golden glow dimming. Henry felt the air shift, colder than before. The whispers returned, no longer distant, no longer carried by the wind. They were inside now. They were closer. We remember. We are waiting. Let us in. Crow gritted his teeth, wrenching the lever one last time. The flame flared, then died. The lantern went out. For the first time in over 100 years, the lighthouse was dark. The whispers stopped. The wind ceased. And then, they knocked. A slow, deliberate knock at the lighthouse door. Crow's breath hitched. His old hands trembled as he reached for something hidden beneath the control panel, a rusted iron key. He held it tight, his knuckles white. "They are here," he whispered. Henry's pulse pounded. "We need to relight the lantern." Crow didn't move. He stared at the door as another knock echoed through the stone walls. Then, something worse. Footsteps. Wet, dragging footsteps inside the lighthouse. Henry turned, his breath sharp and ragged. The spiral staircase behind them, which had been empty just moments ago, was now wrong. Water pooled on the iron steps. The air smelled of brine and decay. And from the darkness below, something was coming up. A shape emerged, a man, or something that had once been a man. His clothes were tattered, his skin swollen and grey, his hollow eyes locked onto Henry with a hunger beyond life. Behind him, more figures took shape, their forms shifting in the dim light. The drowned had come. Crow exhaled slowly. "It's time." Henry turned to him, panic rising. Time for what? The old keeper pressed the iron key into Henry's hand. "To take my place." Henry froze. "What?" Crow gripped his shoulder, his eyes clouded but certain. Someone must keep the light. Someone must remember the names. He stepped back, his face calm, as if he had made peace with this long ago. "Run, Henry." The figures on the staircase moved faster now, dragging themselves upward, water dripping from their skeletal fingers. Crow turned to face them. He did not run. Henry's breath caught. He wanted to stay, to fight, but he knew. He knew. The keeper had made his choice. Henry clenched the key in his fist and ran. Down the twisting stairs, through the darkened chamber, past the rows of books filled with the names of the lost. The whispers screamed now, furious, desperate. The mist had seeped inside, curling through the doorways, grasping at his ankles. But Henry didn't stop. He reached the lighthouse door and wrenched it open. The night air hit him like a wave. The sea roared, the mist rolling back, and for the briefest moment, Henry thought he heard Crow's voice, not in fear, but in command. Then the door slammed shut behind him. The lighthouse shook. A deep, resounding silence followed. Then, light. The lantern blazed to life, cutting through the darkness, brighter than Henry had ever seen it. The storm recoiled. The mist thinned. The whispers faded into nothing. Henry staggered backward, chest heaving. He looked up, breath catching in his throat. The lighthouse still stood. The light still burned. But Elias Crow was gone. Henry took a shaky step forward, feeling the weight of the iron key in his palm. He looked up at the lantern, its golden glow steady once more. And in that moment, he understood. The light had never simply been a warning. It had been a barrier, a prison, a duty passed from one keeper to the next. Henry looked at the sea, the endless, hungry sea. The wind carried a whisper, soft, almost gentle now. We will wait. Henry tightened his grip on the key. He turned back to the lighthouse and stepped inside. The new keeper had taken his place. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. If you're craving more mysteries, thrillers, and spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss out on the next chapter. The darkness is always waiting, and the next story could be just around the corner. See you in the next one, if you dare.